It is another interesting edition of the Economy and Politics show where we bring you key economic developments as they affect the households. This edition brings you the quest for transparency and accountability in Nigeria's oil and gas sector. That has been decades topic in the industry. And my guest is Mr. Chukwuemeka Osuji, Director Olaniwun Ajayi LP, Oil and Gas Practice. Nice to have you on the program. Good morning.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Good morning to the viewers.
Yes, good morning. Before we begin the discourse, let's give you a wrap of some stories from last week. The Governor of Central Bank of Nigeria, Mr. Godwin Emefiele, formally launched the 100 for 100 policy on production and productivity with the presentation of the commemorative checks worth 23.2 billion naira to 28 beneficiaries through 7 participating financial institutions. Presenting the checks to the beneficiaries, which comprised 14 companies in the manufacturing sector, 12 in the agricultural sector, and 2 in the healthcare sector at the bank's head office, Mr. Emefiele disclosed that the 100 for 100 PPP was designed by the CBN to stimulate investments in Nigeria's priority sectors with the core objective of boosting production and productivity. Also last week, it was reported that Nigeria missed its crude oil output target for January 2022, pumping 1.46 million barrels per day against a target of 1.68 million barrels per day as approved by the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC. Officials of the Federal Ministry of Petroleum Resources and the Nigerian National Petroleum Company Limited said the country's continued inability to meet its output target had caused the repeated plunge in oil earnings, leading to the monthly drop in the NNPC's remittance to the Federation account. We go on a break, and when we return, the conversation will continue.
Tune in to Web TV Daily to stay up to date and informed on the financial market, personal finance, and more. We have got you covered with all your favorite TV shows, economy and politics, market review, women's series, millennial talk, Islamic Finance Weekly, The Brief, exclusive interviews, events, and we keep you up to date on all the updates in the financial market with the market opening gong. Watch premium content. Watch Web TV. Same news, different perspective.
Welcome back. If you're joining us, it's the Economy and Politics show, and we are looking at the quest for transparency and accountability in Nigeria's oil and gas sector. And our guest is Mr. Chukwuemeka Osuji. He's the Director of Oil and Gas Practice in Olaniwun Ajayi legal firm. Nice to have you once again, Mr. Chukwuemeka. And of course, the first major issue is the petroleum subsidy. It was supposed to, by the federal government's timeline, be phased out by June, but now there's an extension for 18 months. Again, the issue of transparency and accountability has come to the fore. And what are the implications for the oil and gas sector considering the reforms and the Petroleum Industry Act activities?
Thank you very much. So just sort of to set the stage, and I'll try to approach it from in the manner that I sort of try to explain some of the key ingredients of what has happened before I then delve into where we are now and what we think the future will look like. As we're all aware, I won't bother repeating the facts that's all out there in the public space. As we're all aware, what has happened was that the PIA pretty much set the tone for what we're seeing at the moment. The PIA, the provisions of the Petroleum Industry Act already sets the tone by providing for the removal of the subsidies, such that the prices of petroleum products will be driven largely by market forces. And of course, when we see that the focus of this discourse is on PMS, because as most of us are aware, a good number of the other petroleum products are already fully or partially deregulated at the moment. But PMS is the focal point, given the implications of the PMS to wider economic issues in Nigeria, including how it affects pretty much everybody within the social strata. So the PIA as a law had set that objective, which is that the deregulation would be a thing of the past. But now in terms of implementation, what the government had done, one of the points it's important to mention was that the PIA also recognizes that the implementation of that particular principle, that's the removal, might have certain spill-on effects. So the PIA had the NNPC as the supplier of last resort to do all it can within a period. I think it's about a 6-month period to supply sufficient products to ensure there is sufficiency of PMS in the country and in the economy. And what that was supposed to do was to sort of provide a buffer for the transition to a session where we are fully regulated. Yes. So that was sort of the framework in terms of the legal and regulatory framework we were looking at the time. And then the government then, of course, articulated its intentions to go ahead and remove the subsidy. Naturally, of course, complaints, feedback, a lot of stakeholders have spoken about the wide implications and things or points that I think that are very topical, has been in the public space for weeks, months, years even. So I do not need to repeat them. So what the government did was, considering some of these, the reactions it got from the sector, the government pretty much took a second view and decided that rather than implement the subsidy removal, maybe they would adopt an extension. So they're looking at extension. And for a few people who maybe might have been privileged to listen to the press conference by the Honorable Minister of Petroleum Resources, at the point he had said that they were looking at 8 months, but 8 months is sort of tentative because the executives need to work hand in glove with the National Assembly, because it's not just an extension, given that the law, the PIA, had set the tone for the subsidy removal. Any attempts by the executives to either delay or suspend or extend that policy thrust would have to be done in consonance with the National Assembly. So they are speaking with the National Assembly and the working hand in glove. They're thinking of an 18-month period should be sufficient time to not just for the extension, but also to put in place the necessary regulatory framework in terms of maybe amendments to the PIA to ensure that that is done. So that's really where we are at the moment. The subsidy removal will no longer take place at the moment. We're looking at an 18-month period within which that will be done. But other things to take into consideration, and people have asked this question, why was that provision enshrined in the PIA? And the question is not about the propriety of the provision, whether it's a good thing to have or not a good thing to have. But however, given the topical nature of that point, as well as the implementation requirements coming out from it, some people are of the view that maybe the principle of the subsidy removal alone could have been enshrined in the PIA. Then in addition to that, the PIA would then expressly empower the minister or some other authority to then, through a guideline of a framework, roll out what it takes in terms of how the industry is evolving and the economy, what it takes is then an appropriate timeline to implement that. Yeah. And the thinking around that line is, if it had been done that way, perchance, we wouldn't be thinking about maybe amendments to the PIA at the moment. What would have simply happened is for the minister then to consult with all the stakeholders, within the National Assembly, even Labour, and to then begin to would be an appropriate timeline to do this. And of course, as we're aware, the implementation of this is sort of, let me not say tied, but one of the key considerations, it's the coming on stream of the Dangote refinery, which is supposed to come on stream sometime third quarter of this year, at least maybe 75% capacity at a time. Definitely. Yes, so the government is also hoping that by the time the Dangote refinery comes on stream, that huge supply that will be coming into not just the Nigerian market, but also the West African region would help to buffer the implications of that. Well, there's a bit of debate as to the pricing mechanics, because if the refinery, the products from the Dangote refinery are coming in, at what prices are they coming in? Certainly, one will not expect them to come in at the deregulated prices. We are not sure what we're going to get to. We are not quite sure how the subsidy removal will be implemented. But one key thing that the minister did say at the time was that the law does not contemplate a phased removal. So except what they're going back to the National Assembly will also then put in place a framework for the phased removal. Looking at the text of the law as it stands at the moment, it's not a phased removal. It is simply a removal. So that's where we are at the moment. In terms of the wider implications, I would say that people have a sense of a bit of a reprieve at the moment, but I'm sure that all those involved in that value chain are not happy, understandably. the prices of PMS and some of these products that are not yet regulated are a reflection of a lot of factors, including the valuation, the economy, global prices of crude, etc. So to the extent to which we've seen significant movement in those prices, one would imagine that there's a significant pressure on both those on the value chain as well as the government, who must cut out the funds to support or to subsidize the prices we are paying at the moment to just let go of the subsidy. But the government is still working on the mechanics, and hopefully in the next couple of months, I think, we will then begin to get a better sense of what the interactions with the National Assembly will look like and what amendments are being proposed to the PIA, and whether the amendments will be pure amendments to the PIA or whether they're thinking of other avenues through which they can then implement the changes they're looking at.
Yeah, Mr. Chukwuemeka, it's very clear because the issue of phased removal is out of it. It should be more of complete overhaul. That doesn't augur well if you're doing a phase. There has to be complete overhaul. And we'll still get to that conversation in the course of this discourse. But the key global developments, the optics, we're seeing geopolitical developments between Russia, NATO, and US. Of course, other issues are going to affect global crude oil price. For now, we can say the $80 regime is looking good for us, even our benchmark. But what are going to be implications this year for the industry, and what do you see happening? I mean, in the news we read, January we produced 1.4 million barrels per day, below our 1.6 estimate. Is that the trend that will continue? What are other developments that we should look out for?
Funny enough, I was having a discussion with a colleague about this a few days ago. So what had happened was late 2021, the projections 2021, Friday 2021, roughly around maybe slightly under the $70 to the barrel, then went all the way up to 80 plus sometime in October, and then tapered down a little bit to just maybe early 80s or late 70 pricing at the end of the year. So there were projections, okay, people have estimated that, okay, maybe modest increases. But what we saw was that between January 1st and the end of January, the prices had gone up to as high as 90. And that was a reflection of some, as you mentioned, some of these global factors that have come in, and the fact that at the moment, even the easing up of restrictions, global restrictions on account of COVID-19, there's more movement. As you can see in the UK, for example, almost everybody's going back to work, the tubes are all full. So there's now more movement, and more movement translates to more requirements for energy. But at the moment, production or supply hasn't caught up to that demand. So as long as supply has not caught up to the demand, that means that the price will continue to reflect that difference between the supply and the demand in the interim. And of course, one other key thing that has happened is the energy transitioning drive and the strategic divestments and portfolio rationalization by a lot of IOCs is sort of affecting how things are happening. The industry is sort of in a state of flux. So what you've seen is that a couple of what we used to be petroleum companies, which are now energy companies, are now beginning to look at investments in renewables. So that means the traditional investments you would have expected to come in the petroleum space isn't really coming in, particularly for Nigeria. Over the last 4 years, what we've seen, it has been a gradual dwindling of investments to the Nigerian upstream sector in particular. Not the smaller marginal sort of investments, but the major investments that you really need to sort of have a bit of impact. And that has reflected in the reduction in our production volumes. Now, whether we think prices will continue to inch up, personally, I think so. In the short term, it will. But sometime in the year, when other factors come into play, you have more investments, and then supply actually increases to sort of match the demand. I think the prices will taper down a little bit.
Yeah. And interestingly, you mentioned Dangote. I mean, we look at deepening our local content production in the industry. I mean, Dangote is a very big one for us, indigenous, but big player now. By the time it's concluded third quarter, then there's a BOA prospect, maybe by 2025 in Akwa Ibom State. And then there's several other refineries, like those ones that are not in the huge capacity, modular refineries coming up. So how are these going to really support the local content production and capacity for industry to reduce this consumption of imported PMS?
Well, thankfully, the Nigerian Content Board has, in my view, done a very good job over the last, let's say, 11 years. Pretty much started in 2010. Fantastic job, if you ask me. And what have they done? What they've done is in terms of local capacity building is one key area they paid particular attention to. And in terms of internalizing and localizing a whole lot of the works that previously were externalized in Nigeria. So not just for the Dangote refinery, the huge lot of projects. If you recall the Igina project, an upstream project, but at the same time, that Igina FPSO was one of the projects that had nearly 60 to 70% Nigerian content. Yes. The same thing was replicated for the NLNG Trade 7 project, where working closely with the NLNG, the local content was able to get to a stage where not only did the project start off, even the EPC contracting was able to be executed at the time when COVID-19 was ravaging. Yeah. And not only that, you could see also from that project that the NLNG working with the Nigerian Content Board had sort of committed to have nearly about 50% local content, Nigerian content in that project. And I'm talking of nearly $12 billion project. It's a massive project. Now, another strategic thing the NCDMB has done has been actually putting a bit of skin in the game. They had committed, and not only did they commit, they actually did it to support indigenous companies who are involved in the oil and gas value chain in terms of project development. So, for example, projects like the Water Smith refinery and a few other refinery projects which have actually started off, the NCDMB is supported by making equity investments. And that's very good, because that was just a clear indicator, clear signal to the industry that they were not only willing to put place policies and measures, but they were also willing to support by putting in funds to enable some of these companies to start up with this project. So I think if they continue on this trajectory over the next couple of years, particularly, and if you tie this in, not just in the refinery sector, but also what is happening for the marginal field sector, where you now begin to see that significant number of indigenous companies are getting involved in upstream production. If the Nigerian Content Board continues to create its capacity and continues to bring out policies and to then support where needed, you also notice, for example, the PIA is also helping in this regard. The PIA has about 2 funds which have been dedicated to support, for example, though investments in gas, major gas infrastructure, which could be a source of either initial financing or refinancing. So, but if all these are tied together, and I mean policy, law, and then the implementation itself, because as we all know, we have a lot of laws that speak to where we need to be and what we need to be doing. But where Nigeria actually, gets short of the mark is implementation. So sometimes it's not a function of the laws, but a function of how the laws are actually being implemented, the persons that are implementing it. But I think the NCDMB has set a good example in the sector. And if they continue along lines that they've continued, one key area I failed to mention is in the area of host community engagement. So one key thing they've tried to ensure is that indigenous companies, not just indigenous companies, but also the IOCs, all the players, have these significant interactions and interface with the host communities. Yes, there's skirmishes here and there, areas of disagreement, but you can see that interaction, and it has helped certain companies. For example, I know that companies like Seplat have a community sort of initiative program, and they even have programs that are set out to help indigenous contractors and subcontractors to develop their capacity to support indigenous companies. So you see, that whole effect, which all stems from what the NCDMB is doing in terms of setting the stage, is something that we're beginning to already see the impact in the industry. And if it continues along those lines, I think in the next few years, that drive, that policy trust for capacity development is something we'll be well on the way to achieve.
Yeah, Chukwuemeka, as we wrap up, can you in 1 minute tell us what are those top 3 things that needs to be done to really entrench transparency and accountability in the oil and gas industry? This is over a 4-decade industry, but these are issues that still been like as if it's an utopia. Would it require political will? Is it just that the PIA should just be implemented? What are those things? Because if you look at it recently, even knowing how much is produced, required, reporting, those are issues that have raised a lot of concerns, particularly when the NPC said it needed 3 trillion naira for the subsidy regime, and Governors Forum, the minister, everybody were like, we need to go back to accountability and transparency.
You're absolutely right. For me, I approach it slightly differently. And how I approach it is, if you were to start a business in a sector that is currently constrained or becoming unpopular, what are you going to do as a manager? So I think the leaders of the petroleum sector in Nigeria need to begin to approach the sector as if it was a business. You've set up a business to supply bread, But we found out that increasingly, most people are no longer eating bread, or they rather have something else because they don't want to get involved in wheat. So what should you be doing to continue to remain not just profitable, but to continue to produce your bread? That is at the bedrock of what I think should happen in the oil and gas sector. So in terms of implementation, the PIA, and we all cried over a decade for the PIA to come on board. It's been there. But the PIA is not the end of it. It's not the objective. It's not the goal. It's merely the beginning of the journey. The PIA is merely a framework that sets what we need, the pedestal we need to do, what we then need to do. The key aspect is implementation. We must realize that our industry is now a dying industry. Not that oil and gas will, in the conceivable future, become irrelevant. It will never be irrelevant. It will continue to be relevant. But its pride of place, its privacy, is now reducing amongst other global competitive factors. So that should be a core consideration. So the leaders of the industry, first thing to do is we need to have a handshake with the operators in the sector. There's no other way forward, because the government will not produce the oil and gas. The government can't run the sector on its own. So the government needs to have that handshake with the operators to ensure that even though the laws have been set in place, in terms of its implementation, in terms of the enabling environments we're looking at, in terms of the impacts of the investments, that all the other key factors, for example, things like ease of doing business, investors need to come into these markets and see that, even in terms of getting approvals, and the PIA has done a fantastic job in terms of a bit of certainty around that area, but I said, need to do that. Then that transparency point you mentioned is also very key. The oil and gas sector has traditionally been known as a sector that is very opaque. I think we need to move away from that mentality. The more transparent you are, then the more key stakeholders understand what you're doing, and more importantly, where you are going. With that certainty comes the confidence that they need to invest long-term into the sector, because they now understand what you're doing and where you're going. So that transparency, and we have a couple of agencies who are working on that, 90 and a few others, but you then begin to see a bit of competitive tension. I see there's competitive tension between them and the government. That shouldn't be the case. The government should, as a matter of direct policy and law, drive transparency in the sector. The more transparent the sector is for the stakeholders and the players, then the easier it is for investors, both local and foreign, to understand where they stand. Even if the regime is tight, it doesn't matter. But as long as there's clarity, that clarity makes it easy for people to understand the state of play, and then they can then take either the short-term view of the sector or the long-term view. We are not just looking at growing the oil and gas sector. The oil and gas sector must then provide that springboard we need to transit to things like our renewables, and to then help most critically the non-oil sector to grow. Really is the future, being able to leverage on the oil and gas sector to help the non-oil sectors of the economy to grow. So that's it for me. But transparency, as you said, is key. Something we have to get sorted out.
Government must drive transparency so that Nigerians can trust the sector, and even when they want to move the subsidy to the PIA, people can trust it and engage further. Thank you very much, Mr. Chukwuemeka Osuji, Director, Oil and Gas Practice, Olaniwun Ajayi legal firm, for your very clear insights on how we can achieve transparency and accountability in Nigeria's oil and gas industry. We hope to have you subsequently to discuss further when the build-up to this final phase is done. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. Thank you, viewers. I look forward to coming again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That'll be all for this edition of the Economy and Politics Show. If you have questions, comments, or suggestions on the quest for transparency and accountability in Nigeria's oil and gas sector, please send them to otobasi.abasecon@prochange.com. We'll be glad to respond to you. Also join our website, www.prochange.com, to read our latest news articles on the oil and gas industry. We have it captured for you on our website. And you can also engage us via social media platforms displayed on the screen. Till we come your way again, thank you for watching and have a nice day.